The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Chris, go ahead and start sharing your screen, please. Good afternoon. On behalf of the Northeast Conference on the Teaching of Foreign Languages, I would like to welcome you to our special webinar to support educators in this unprecedented time of emergency closure due to COVID-19. This afternoon's webinar is entitled Rethinking the Flipped Classroom for Remote Learning. This webinar has been generously sponsored by Wayside Publishing. Please visit waysidepublishing.com for more information about how Wayside can assist your remote teaching and learning needs. My name is John Carlino, NECFL Executive Director, and I will be hosting this afternoon's webinar along with NECFL Vice Chair Michael Bogdan and NECFL Board Member Debbie Espedia as moderators. We are grateful to our presenter, Christopher Gwin, for offering his time and expertise. This webinar will be recorded. A link to the recording will be posted to our website when available. This webinar is scheduled to last 1 hour with 45 to 50 minutes devoted to the presenter. The remaining time will be for Q&A. Attendees are encouraged to submit questions during the webinar using the question feature of the GoToWebinar control panel on the side of your screen. Our moderators will organize these questions and share them with the presenter as relevant and/or at the end. In the event of technical difficulties, please remain connected as you are able. If the difficulties are on your end, please contact GoToMeeting customer support for assistance. If you are having trouble with your audio, in the control panel under audio, click on phone call and call in with the number provided. And now please let me take this opportunity to introduce you to our presenter, Christopher Gwin. Christopher has been teaching German for 30 years, currently part-time at Haddonfield High School in New Jersey and at the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia. He serves on the board of directors and is the executive director of the National Federation of Modern Language Teachers Associations. Christopher is also very active in AATG. He has taught methods courses at Rowan University and Rutgers University in New Jersey, and has taught online German courses for iCademy Dubai in the United Arab Emirates. Most recently, he has been active on the Diversity and Inclusion Task Force for ACTFL. Chris, thank you for sharing your time with us. Welcome to the webinar.
Thank you, John. I hope everybody can see me in the screen okay. I wanted to start by saying thank you to you for spending this time with us. I think there's a lot to consider here, and I'm really hoping we can continue this dialogue after today in other spaces and other venues. I want to start with a quick anecdote. In preparing to talk about flipped instruction for remote learning, I really thought about something that happened early in the school year. So I wanted to share that quickly with you at the beginning as an anecdote, kind of set up our thinking for today. The first assignment I gave the high school students was for them to think about communication in their lives today. So this was September at the beginning of the school year. They had 3 days to complete the assignment, and I assigned them to go to a public space somewhere in town, maybe a market, maybe a cafe, maybe the post office, maybe the train station, and observe people's behavior for about 15 minutes. Look at people they didn't know from a distance who were communicating without using a device, who were using face-to-face communication. I wanted them to observe their body language, their gesturing, their emotions, if they could try to guess what the topic might have been that was being discussed based on the things that they could see, and to take some notes and to bring those notes to class. And I did this because I wanted them to focus on their own communication and what it meant. Simultaneously, at the beginning of the university semester, I asked the students to do their first writing piece, and we asked them to do that in English to bring them into the curriculum and the format and the structure and the way that the courses work. And we asked them in that first piece of writing to look very specifically at how they use technology for learning. So I then took some of that anecdotal information from those students, I used it anonymously, and I shared it with the high school students, and I asked them to comment on reactions they had to what the university students were saying. I asked them to note things that resonated with them and things that they saw very differently. And I shared this information on parent night to try to bring the parents in a little bit. And the whole thing was fascinating. And it's in my mind now that we're talking about this today, because fast forward to March and everything changed dramatically. If this is something you're interested in, I'd be happy to share some of that with you outside of this setting. You could contact me and I could share some of that data. Just the comparison between those students' experiences alone is something I think it's really worth reading. I was also thinking at that time, kind of driven to do that by what kind of policy I was going to have in the high school class and university classes with regard to mobile phones. And I thought my way through it, and I made the decision that in the university classes I would have no policy. They could use a device if they wanted to. And the high school classes, these are freshmen, that they would not have access to their devices during instruction. And we've had a couple of times during the year to talk about that. And that factors into this a little tiny bit. I'm going to go to the next slide, and I'm showing you a striking image. Hopefully this is provoking a little bit of thought or creativity on your part. I like to start lessons with a striking image, something visual, because I think that it can enliven for students a little bit of creativity, spark their imagination. It's low anxiety in the interpretive mode because there isn't text or audio for students to try to figure out and understand. It's just something they have to perceive visually. So why am I showing you this image as the first thing? It really is not the topic, but when putting together the topic for today, I decided that we had to have a really jazzy title, because as you know, when you make a professional development presentation or you do a webinar, the title really matters. If people are flipping through the program book trying to decide, or looking through the app trying to decide which session to go to, the title often attracts or doesn't attract them. So I said, we'll call it Flip or Flop. And then, of course, I thought about flip-flops. And then I thought some people call them thongs. And then some people call them beach shoes. And then I thought about the onomatopoeia of flip-flop. And then I thought about it in other languages. And it brought me back to a project we had done previously where we looked at art objects made from flip-flops that people in African countries find washing up on the beach. So it took me into the space of sustainability, which of course is a topic for another time, not for today, but I just thought the thought process there was worth sharing. Now, let's center ourselves on our topic today. Let's kind of focus in to what we're trying to achieve together in the space that we have. I would like you to think about your own experience. This is the way for us to center ourselves. It's for you to think about your own experience. Use these three images and think about what the emergency shift to remote instruction was like for you. Use these three images to help guide your thinking. I'm going to be quiet for 30 seconds and let you think about this prompt. I hope that you had a chance to think about that, and I'll ask you these questions. What was your experience in the emergency shift to remote instruction? Did you pivot gracefully? Were you like the first image? Was it seamless for you? Did you stumble slightly, but then you regained your footing quickly and things are moving along smoothly? Or are you with me? Are you in category number 3? Did you flat out on the sidewalk down, fall, struggle to back up, get back up, regain your consciousness, and not really sure where you are? I thought it was a good way to just take a moment here at the beginning and have us focus on the shift. I think it will allow us to do some planning ahead. And if you're in category 1, I say that that's tremendous. Congratulations. I'm most certainly in category 3. I keep hearing radio ads in my local area for private schools. I think they're trying to attract students for the fall, and they're making claims about having pivoted seamlessly to full online instruction during the emergency shutdown. Was not my experience, but I'm curious to hear what you would have to say about it. I think we should consider these goals for the session today. Just take a second to look through them, and I would really appreciate your feedback at the end. If we approached these, if we aimed towards them, if we achieved something, it would be nice to know at the end how your experience was. So I'll just let you read through the 3 goals. And I look forward to your feedback at the end. Just a quick note about me. I tried to encapsulate myself in a slide. That was challenging to do that, but I want to just say something with great pride. I've been proud about this all year. This is my 30th year of teaching. I don't know what I'm going to do next year when it's 31. That's not going to be as interesting, but it's really a time to pause and reflect. Currently, I teach part-time at a traditional comprehensive high school in the shadow of Philadelphia, and I teach part-time at a private university. I have taught at a private international school only asynchronously for a school in Dubai in the United Arab Emirates, and I have previously taught community college at an urban high school and a rural high school. I think I have a wide scope of the teaching experience. I've also worked in the methods area. But I think it's important for you to know also that my passion is wide and includes gardening and, of course, chocolate and the seashore. So that kind of rounds it out for you. Who is this presenter with you today? And again, thank you for joining us. So let's just dive right in. I'm wondering what you're bringing with you to the webinar today. What do you have personally as a good working definition for the flipped classroom? Let's just take a moment and consider where you are with this. For me, I've been on this journey for several years. I really started to think about it under the umbrella of what can I do to improve instruction. I've always been very keenly interested in, passionate about effective instruction and efficiency in the classroom. And those two things drove me to look into the flipped classroom. Been working on it for a number of years and really wonder where other people are. I can't say that I'm an expert. I don't believe in bandwagoning. I don't join the latest thing that comes along. I really do try to be thoughtful about effectiveness and efficiency in the classroom. But just take a second and think, if you were pushed right now, if we were in a dialogue, would you be able to have a working definition of a flipped classroom? I'll share this slide with you. Just a quick sort of historical background. I did a literature search and did some research on how people have been talking about this. And I think it's important to take a moment and think about the work of Allison King, who published in 1993. And we now all know this phrase, from the sage on the stage to the guide on the side. And that to me was the start of the paradigm shift away from thinking about curriculum and teaching, as I was taught when I was in school preparing, to now the focus on learning and teaching. And that shift, that difference, I think is really important, just to take a moment and think about that. And then what has come since then, what has come forward from there. And I would offer you from this slide, it's something to bookmark as your resource, the three print options here. That might be a good thing to bookmark to have as a resource when you're developing lessons, working on modules, curriculum, and you want to go back and say, what were those tenets? What were the key ideas? Two of those are language specific, and the third one is Bergman and Sam's, and we'll talk about them in a second. But I offer this slide to you as a way, as a kind of a framework for thinking about this. Most people know John Bergman, Aaron Sam. They really propelled the movement forward. I think it moved into a new space after they began their work, and their work is different than what we're approaching today. They recorded their high school chemistry lessons and made the recordings available for students. And I think that we're really approaching that differently today. But let's go back one step and let's look at what the traditional model of instruction was. And I think that this image really encapsulates it very clearly. So let's now think about what we know and what we understand about the traditional model of instruction. I'll let you read the 3 points on this slide. This is a traditional classroom. This is traditional learning. I'm pausing so you have time to read it. And I'm really curious how you're feeling about this traditional model in light of the emergency shutdown of schools and how that may or may not have had an impact on how you think about the traditional model of learning, of education, of teaching. I think these 4 points are also really worth considering. For me, this slide particularly gives a really good framework to help us think about our own work and an attempt we might be making now, suddenly, to make the classroom a virtual space. For me, 4.4 is really critical. Back to an effective and efficient classroom, I want there to always be space for critical thinking, for higher order thinking skills. I want to move instruction as quickly as possible away from memorization and drill to thinking and constructing and creating. And this framework of 4 points to consider in flipping instruction, I think is really a good way to frame that. Here's a specific example for world languages. These are 5 points that I think are a good working definition. For me, in this first part, our first goal of our time here together, to me, this is the critical slide. I think that these 5 points help us to define flipping in the world languages arena and how it can make sense for us. I'm going to pause again so you can read carefully these 5 points and then think about what it means for you. I'm going to show you an example of a school that went fully forward with flipping. This is an example from the Detroit Public Schools, and they made the decision that the entire freshman class would do flipped instruction in both math and English. Look at the left side. There are 3 percentages of things the school was dealing with before they flipped instruction, and the right side shows you the change, all positive, for the school after flipping. Here is what they did in that high school, in the Detroit Public Schools. This is their model for flipping. Something to think about sort of in the wider context. A point here that's important for me to consider is students having access. So they made it as part of their program that students would have access on the school site and wouldn't have to rely on having access outside of the school setting. I have 2 questions for the people in the Detroit Public Schools. Question number 1, how was the transition? How long did it take? How difficult, treacherous, bumpy, smooth was the transition from the traditional model of instruction to the flipped model? And how long did it take to get student buy-in? Those are the 2 questions I would like to ask as I think about that. But of course, we can see what we're talking about here is not new. It's not revolutionary. Here's a couple of statistics to show us that we've been involved in this all along. Think about your own experience in school as a learner. When did you encounter these kinds of structures? In what venues, and what impact did it have on you? And I think what we've talked about so far might lead you up to this question: does this work? Is there evidence? And we have some resources for you in the presentation that show evidence that this method is effective. I would say anecdotally, all I can share are anecdotes from my own instructional experience, but I would say that I have seen learners of language really move more quickly along the proficiency guideline with flipped instruction. I think that they use out-of-class time much more productively. I think they're more thoughtful generally, more creative, and if I could be so bold, more invested in their learning. So I'm going to show you just quickly a specific example. I'm going to skip through these slides and you can access them later and take a look. I did a talk about this topic at ACTFL a couple of years ago, American Council on the Teaching of Foreign Languages. And I was really impressed by the work of Susan Hunyaki, and she's at Michigan State. And I'm sharing here with you a couple of her slides, I have permission, that are part of her dissertation. And I teach German, and this is a specific example from German, but I think it has the wide applicability. And she did a focus using computer-assisted language learning and in those strands. So I'm going to just flip through, but I invite you later to come back and take a careful look at what she did, how she set this up, and what her experience was, the traditional model of instruction, and then how she flipped it. So I invite you to that because she has these conclusions. Again, I'm skipping over, but it's something that I think it's worth it for you to take a look later when you have time. So we're going to just take a pause right here. Oh yeah, that's a nice image. That's a very good image, I think, to pause with. And we'll ask Mike and Deb if up to this point anybody has written in the chat any questions they have about the framework or the methodology for flipped instruction.
Hi, Chris.
Hi there.
That's my backyard since I'm on the Delaware shore.
Yeah, the other side. That's good.
Wouldn't that be nice?
Yeah.
We do have a question. In regards to students, not who don't have access, but the ones who refuse to work at home, what kinds of, strategies or, what are some solutions for that perhaps? As
Yeah, boy, that's a strong term to say students who refuse to work at home. And we were chatting a little bit before we started today, talking about how in remote instruction, in this emergency shutdown, student motivation and participation has started to drop. I'm presenting here at the beginning examples of flipped instruction in the old model, so flipped instruction when students still came to school. But I would say that, and it's a question we'll ask at the end about how to go forward, but I would say as a quick response, it takes time to build the community in the classroom and to make flipped instruction, flipped lessons part of that community as normal routines, behaviors, and expectations in class. It takes time for students to have buy-in. And I don't know how we can be immediately effective with that in the emergency shutdown and the switch to remote learning. And we'll come back to that in the second section where we look at, our third section today, where we look at the shift to remote instruction. Do we have another question, Mike?
Yes, hi, Chris. So here's a second question. Here's a second question before you continue.
Okay.
So what do you do with those students who do not have the resources such as Wi-Fi or the appropriate technology in order to complete the flipped lesson as you would like?
Yeah, that's another great question, similar to the first one. So let's talk about those in the third section when we talk about remote learning. In the original model of this flipped instruction during traditional class structure when we were all in school, we provided students with access in the school library. We were fortunate to be in a public school where students had access to that. The university students had access to it all over campus. So for a public school in a setting where students don't have access at home, plans have to be in place ahead of time, obviously, to ensure that students can gain access. And I'll show two examples later of alternates for students who absolutely cannot gain access to try to bring them into the interpersonal mode of communication when they can't participate in the out-of-class preparation and lessons. Okay, I'm going to go forward. I know we all want to stay on the slide because now we all want to be at the beach, but we will go forward. And I'm going to show you now some of my own experiences in flipped lessons in the language classroom. And so this is just the quick background. I'm teaching students who are probably novice high, A1. We're on the road to intermediate A2. And here's the theme of the module. You can read that for yourself. I'll put it there in English. And this is the flipped lesson. Let me show you 4 lesson examples very quickly. And so you can see what students did outside of class before coming to class. So they prepared for the class using novel materials and being able to access previously learned structures. And this is what I was expecting. I did not articulate this to the students. To show you what I mean by this as a flipped example, the images the students worked with were new, but they had previously worked on and been exposed to the structure and vocabulary necessary to complete the task. And the descriptions and comparisons they're making are personalized, which I think is really important. And then, of course, I'm teaching German, and it's especially difficult for students to grapple with how to make the difference between the book is lying on the bed and he's laying the book on the bed. That presents in German a special problem for students, and so I wanted to review that. So that's what I expected, but I didn't articulate that because I wanted the organic nature of their interaction with the material in their own personalized way to see what they brought with them to class. So when we were in class together, we then could see that. This is the image. I'm going to stop here for 1 second and let you react to the image, make your own personal reaction to it, and think about what I've asked the learners to do. I'll go back 2 slides. This is what we asked them to do. And here's the image. And you can think about what kind of reaction you would have as a learner if you've been asked to do that task. And we're moving here also, I would mention, into the presentational. So when we come to class together, students are in the presentational mode, and then I force them into the interpersonal mode with my follow-on questions. during the lesson. And again, it's one activity in the lesson. So to the question a person put in the chat about what to do with students with no access, it's not the only thing we're doing in class. So it's not a complete loss if they can't participate in that particular activity. It's a loss, but it's not a complete loss. I'm going to show you the set of images now, and I really want to spark in you your creativity and your interest and your imagination in how you might use these images outside of the school setting for students to prepare for something in class. So to do a flipped lesson where their first encounter with the materials happens in their own individual space prior to sharing in the group space. I'm just going to go through, oh, I forgot to mention this, sorry. So this is what I thought that I knew that they knew, always working in the zone of proximal development. What do they know and are able to do, plus a little bit more. And then, of course, this is why I argue for it as flipped, what we mentioned before about personalization. So here's the set of images. Let's just go through quickly. And you can think about your own personal reaction, how you would handle it as a learner, what it would mean to you to work with vocabulary, you know, don't know, structures, how detailed you would be motivated to be or not be. And let this kind of wash over you and think about how lesson design works when we're flipping the instruction, when we're personalizing and taking away from the traditional model of instruction. So that's the set of images. I think that the variety can be inspirational to students. Some of the images are target culture specific. Some of the images are own culture specific. And I think that that works, that balance, to try to keep the learner's attention. I try to use enough variety to elicit wide and deep descriptions, to try to bring about a desire on the part of the students to be descriptive so that they'll take the time to look up new words. I try to use images from the target culture whenever possible. In the PowerPoint later, there's a slide to help you if you need to find royalty-free images for your own work. Here's the second example. Different than the first, in this case, the students are provided with something they've never seen before. This is brand new, but they have had some vocabulary, some structures, and all they see in their task when they're outside of school are the images, and it's their responsibility to work independently with these images. And I always have one caveat: don't print out the slides, right? Just work with your notes. There's a lot of data coming in now from the research about the importance of handwriting while processing notes. And again, this could be considered a vocabulary review plus a little bit more I+1 moving across the zone of proximal development. And here's this example. It's under this topic, module topic. And of course, everybody has a food unit. There's always a food unit, but this is inside of the larger module on health and the idea around cooking as an example. And this, I think, is important because I'm curious about what it is that they did to prepare the materials at home. I'm doing a secret review of the past tense. Where they are with the past tense, that's part of it. I don't outright say we're practicing it, but it's embedded in. Here's one of the slides from that PowerPoint that they worked on outside of class to think about what they wanted to say, how they wanted to structure their commentary. Here's the second slide. Some of it is not target culture specific. I'm gonna show this slide again to say I think it's important to have clear, simple, and direct images that are easy for students to interpret. Again, low impact interpretive mode, because all they're doing is looking at the visual. There's no audio or textual component for the interpretation. More or less cultural specificity, depending on what we're doing. This, again, is just one activity in the lesson. It's not the entire lesson. So if a student had a situation and couldn't get access, they can try to participate without having the same level of preparation maybe as other people. These are my random questions I asked across the class. Other people may want to do a more formal or a more structured assessment. But this often gives me, kind of in a popcorn way, a sense of how many people prepared. I can also make some careful notes on how students are doing with the past tense when they try to explain point number 2. So it goes from the presentational spoken to an interpersonal, because I then ask the follow-on questions and bring them into that space for the interpersonal. And so this is a good time for us to stop and think about our special case. Unlike other areas, we really have access to all the realia. This is my very quick 3-point definition of realia. Just take a look at it and see if you agree. And I think that we're in a special place to look at that and really think about how it can play a role in what we're doing. Here's an example from the German language curriculum. This is my third example of a flipped lesson. And now we're talking about moving students into intermediate, really away from novice, becoming intermediate speakers of the language. I'm using this German language youth television show, and we use it on a regular basis. So students are familiar with the format, and it's easy. We develop that in class first, so they know the format, so it's easy to use as a flipped lesson. For me, the high school experience is all about moving through intermediate. That's the whole breadth of the high school experience. This is just one example from the target culture I'm looking at. Think about your own target cultures and youth-oriented TV shows that you know and have access to. Here's the example of what we do with this as a flipped lesson. Their initial engagement with the audio and video material is outside of class. Special note there that I always give them several days with an audio or video or something that's internet bound, just in case. I always try to structure the lesson so we have time for that. Sometimes these are tight, sometimes these are very open-ended. Again, it depends on what my goal is, but because they know the format, it's easy for me to be flexible in that way. Very good moment to stop here for a second and think about our friends at the PACE model. I think that the PACE model really works well in these types of flipped lessons. If you haven't tried it yet, I put a slide in here to think about it. If you need a refresher on the PACE model, chapter 7 in the Shrum and Glisten text, and I think that it fits various lessons in the 3 modes of communication in the flipped classroom. Here's my fourth example. Oh, sorry, just a quick slide to flip it around the other way. I'm flipping the flip in this case. In this case, students work with materials I prepare for them, and we see the video episode during class. So it's there. Looking at vocabulary, carefully doing what they can with it, and then coming to class and seeing the video clip. I have a daring dozen rule about vocabulary. I know most research shows that we should only have 8 vocabulary words for students to process in a lesson, but I kind of moved up to 12, therefore I call it the daring dozen, and 9 of them are in the sort of noun, verb, adjective category mixed, and then 3 other words. And of course, it depends on the context, how we work on that. So that would be an example of what they're doing there. Here's my 4th example. Now we're moving into intermediate mid. They're away from my instruction. They're moving along. And we have at this school an exchange program with schools in Germany. And this is an example of a lesson where students are preparing for the exchange. And the flipped part of this is that the first time they encounter the image created by their partner is outside of the classroom. So it's scaffolded and arranged for them to understand what we're talking about prior to seeing the images, but their initial engagement with the material is outside of the classroom, and I'm using that as an extension activity. You can imagine the kinds of conversations you have in class when you're trying to define terms like cliche, stereotype, prejudice, etc. Also, what I like about this is a good time to provide students with a second channel of communication for them to continue the conversation in whatever learner management software or platforms the school district has to create a second channel for them to continue a dialogue about what they started in class. Just a quick example of what one of the American students put together as the image of his or her understanding of German culture. So I've just put that in there for you to think about. Now you might say to me, I think that's just homework. How do we really know that it's flipping? So please take 1 second here and read through this argument for why what I just presented to you is flipping. And I want to just show you this image to say, remember, we're talking about flipping the original traditional model of instruction and returning it. And that's, I think, a reason to really think about that. There are a number of challenges. I'd like you to consider these 4 basic challenges. I'll give you just a little bit of time to read those. I think points 2 and 3 here go back to what the person asked in the chat about motivating students, and we're going to talk about that in the remote example. But I think it just takes, I would say it just takes time for it to become normal, for it to become the routine and the thing that we do. Difficult to do in an emergency, I realize that. I think these are challenges, but I don't think they're insurmountable. I think the value of flipping speaks over the challenges. Oh, it's time for a break, Deb and Mike. I think this is a very good image to take a little pause here and see if we have another question.
We do. We have this section generated so many questions, Chris.
That's great.
Oh my gosh. So let me start with this one though. Well, maybe not. There were several that were around the concept of pre-teaching vocabulary in relationship to the flipped class, but do you use the flipped classroom setup or process to teach vocabulary?
My answer is yes. There's times when we learn vocabulary together in class, kind of putting up a word map on the wall, on the board, and exploring it together. And there's times when they're expected to grapple with vocabulary outside of class. I don't have ever, this is my own teaching experience, someone else will see it differently, but I don't ever have the magical list of vocabulary we all must know. I think when people want to describe their experiences or try to personalize everything as much as possible, they use the vocabulary they need for that experience. There are some key terms, and I think we can talk about them. I would say it also depends on the context. Some things need teacher explanation, and some things can be handled by students on their own. I would say that's contextually driven. I'm going to just, Mike, if it's okay, go ahead, and we can have a couple more. I'll leave time at the end for more questions if that's okay, Mike.
That's fine, go ahead.
Okay, well, I don't know if anybody wants to go ahead. I think we want to sit and look at this image for a while. If you're wondering why I did this, well, I wanted to keep your attention, so I baked you a cake. If you're curious about the chocolate, I refer you back to the slide about the presenter. Now, let's move into the space of synchronous versus asynchronous instruction in remote learning. And I think that these points, you can read these later, but these are here for you. I put these in from my experience teaching for the private school in Dubai. I thought that that was an incredibly rewarding and rich experience to have students from all over the world coming together to learn the German language. It was important because a lot of students would never have had access in a brick and mortar school. The school where I was, in which I was teaching, students had an option of 100% online, 100% in the brick and mortar school, and a combination of the two things. What I didn't like about asynchronous instruction, I've listed here for you, and I personally didn't find it rewarding. But there was a teacher with whom I was working who had been doing it for 20 years and thought it was the greatest practice. So everybody has a different experience. I'm not attempting to talk negatively about it. It just didn't match my style of instruction. And I think with remote instruction, we can think of 5 things that I think are key. And I think these also speak to flipped learning. So I'm just going to read them out very quickly. I think that the time management piece is crucial. Putting students in a space, putting the learners in a space where they have to manage their capacity to interpret on their own without the teacher's gaze, I think is an important skill. That's why I've enunciated that. And I notice, this is anecdotal, but I notice more creative risk-taking in the remote space. And I think that we're reaching for more. I think that we can ask for more of them because of the use of time, resources, and materials in a different way than our 45 minutes or 50 minutes, whatever we have. And I'll let you read the other 2 points there as well. The limitations are very important. We've already talked about that in these questions today. Access, equipment, space, and time. And I think it's important to note safe space. For many, we always talk about students who have a situation in life where they don't feel safe coming to school. And I think it's easy to forget what it's like for students who only feel safe when they come to school. And I think that has to factor into this conversation. I want to give you 6 points to consider. Up to this point, this is all very recent. This is my experience in remote instruction. And And I think they're challenges. I think they're real challenges. There's been a very robust conversation online about letting students just use Google Translate as part of instruction, and I have some questions about that too. But I just put these points up here as my thinking in the moment of where we are. I do have concerns. I think I was trying to replicate the magic of the classroom in a remote setting, and now a couple of weeks in, I think that that's not wise. I'm going to show you just a couple of lessons really quickly from my own experience. I'm in a very detailed synchronous and asynchronous lessons for the high school students. And so we're in this module. How do I create long-lasting friendships? That's the module we're working in. And this is the structure of how we do asynchronous and synchronous. 4 days a week, they have an asynchronous task. I give them 12 hours to do it. And 1 day a week, we have a synchronous meeting. The principal has asked that everybody do 4 days and give the students 1 day off. So Tuesday is their day off from world languages. Here is, you can look at this later. It's a lot of text on one slide, but it's an exact minute-to-minute of a lesson from 2 weeks ago that we did synchronously with the high school students. So you can just get a sense and see. Activity 1 was brand new. They had never seen it before. It's not flipped in any way. I like to start each time off with something fun, light, engaging. And in this particular case, it was becoming very clear to us that the governor was shutting the schools down for the rest of the school year. And so I asked this question: what are the advantages of learning at home? What are the advantages of learning in the classroom? And they had to just brainstorm that quickly. Activity 2 was something they had prepared at home, so that was flipped in that sense. What the differences were between being a professional athlete and doing sports at school. And they had already thought about that, jotted notes down. So when I called on them, they were drawing on information they had prepared. It wasn't spontaneous. And number 3, as part of what we're working on in this module, we're reading a book. I have a friend who's a professional soccer player, and I'll show you the document the students worked with. This is the actual text that they read at home. This is flipped. They had never seen the text or image prior to working on it at home. And this is the work that I asked them to do. First, I asked them to describe the scene, and then I asked them to define 3 terms. And this goes back to how this is flipped. They did that work at home, and then we just asked them to hold up their notebooks during our synchronous session and show other students their drawings, read for other students their definitions, and share what they had. It's my job then to guide and facilitate misunderstandings, clarifications. We can also ask other students to help clarify as well. If you read German, you can tell how difficult a level this text is or how simple it is. And if you don't read, I would invite you to look at the amount of text. If you don't read German, the amount of text and how we would ask students to manage that and what the visual imagery can elicit from them. And so they had a sheet to help them prepare to come to the class, and then they had this task to do after the lesson asynchronously. So it was a follow-on where they watched a clip of an actual soccer game, women's soccer, and they had to put themselves in the role of the commentator. So it's presentational speaking, but it's also higher on the end of the interpretive mode because they had to listen and manage vocabulary that they knew or didn't know. And we're about in the middle to the end of the book that we're reading. It's a children's story, so they have had a lot of exposure to vocabulary and structures around this. Then I moved them into the interpersonal mode because they create a flip grid and then comment on each other. So it's not pure interpersonal, but it is in a sense of just being able to write comments to each other. So that's an example of how, because we had the structures for flipping in place prior to the emergency shutdown, we could continue it. I'll just show you quickly here my reflection slide. I'm going to skip over that and let you read it at your leisure, but it's some of the challenges that I really faced in trying to maintain the high school courses in a synchronous meeting. I'm teaching in a school where I cannot require them to attend a synchronous meeting online. It's an option, and so I'm trying to reward students who come and not penalize students who don't come. But it's very challenging when a student's not there for what we want to do afterwards. So that goes back to that original question. That really is very tough. I'm going to move now to the university space, and on the left side you can see what we were doing as far as the structure of the university courses prior to the emergency shift, which for us was right at the end of spring break, and then how we made that change after the shift. And I want to comment on the optional 30-minute individual office hour. I made myself available for that. That was not required, but I had this overwhelming feeling of we kind of pulled away everything from the students. We took them off of campus, and I wanted to provide them as much support as I could because I thought that that was such a jarring interruption to their learning. But it forced us into a 100% flipped model for their instruction. So we were in the module at that point, what kind of citizen am I? That's the essential question. Again, all of the modules are driven by essential questions and enduring understanding. That's an example from number 7. And here's 5 points about how that shift was for them. We met ahead of time and did as much work as we could to make the synchronous meetings focus on the interpersonal. Do it with the high school students as well. I think that's the best use of that time. And I'm going to show you now another slide, I'm sorry, with a lot of text on it, but it's again for you to refer to later. But this is a minute-to-minute of how the first university class meeting went synchronously after the break. I think I forgot to say, I do need to emphasize, because the students were sent home, I now had students in 6 different time zones. And we had synchronous meetings, and that's a challenge. So for my students in Shanghai and Beijing, they had to be online at midnight in order to participate in the course. So I made the decision that I would then meet them in the individual meetings at a time that was convenient for them. Inconvenience myself because I inconvenienced them. So I think I wanted to mention that there. So later you can take a look at this and just see how do we use the time. But I start always with sort of an orientation prompt in this case. How are you guys doing? What's going on? How's it going? As a way to bring us all back into the community of learners that we were before the emergency shutdown. I use the Zoom platform, and I like the breakout room option for university students because it gives them a chance to really work one-to-one. They appreciate it. They dive in. I have not done it with the high school students because I can't monitor it, and I feel a little bit less comfortable with that. With the university students, I feel comfortable. And they had already dealt with these questions as part of the module of what kind of citizen am I, and then we're just reviewing them. But it's a new question in the sense of how do they feel about it? How do they feel about these topics now that they're back home? Does being home or changing their living situation have an impact on how they feel? And then the other part of the lesson is also flipped because they had looked at these images as part of their work in the online learning platform ahead of time. And then our last module for the university courses I was teaching is the topic of how does the past determine my present, would be my translation of that. And of course, we're reading from the Song of the Nibelung, as everybody should be reading. And we're carefully working on the narrative past. And so everything was flipped in this module because they did all of their reading at home ahead of time prior to us coming together. And I really think that this worked very well because it allowed us to be very dramatic when we were together in the synchronous lessons. We did dramatic readings of the chapters. We had people take on roles. There was a little bit of costuming, and we had overwhelming full participation. And the reason that this also fits into the flipped learning is when the students were reading their chapters at home from this literature, they were creating content questions and thought questions independently. And those questions drove the next synchronous meeting. So back to here, I'll just go quickly back. When we're in these chats, these group discussions, it was about 10 minutes of a 50-minute meeting, I'm trying to say as little as possible. I might be asked a vocabulary word, I might jump in on something large, but I try to not say a word so that they're using the space they have together to stay in the interpersonal mode and engage with each other. And here, they're driving it. After having read, they're bringing us to the new understanding through their content and thought questions. When I see that we've missed a major point or there's something I just feel we have to get to, then I will guide and facilitate questions or ask follow-on questions, or when we don't have them, step in. But I really like the space to be for the university students to be sharing together. What I also want to say about this experience, I'm going to just make a couple of comments about the university students. I think it was stressful for them in a different way than the high school students to make the emergency shift. I did everything I could to make it valuable and meaningful, but we had to cut down content because of the situation we were in. I made the purposeful and intentional decision that the synchronous meetings would focus on the interpersonal mode of communication. And that meant I gave up putting them in the interpretive mode by talking through a lesson. What I think was positive about this module, and it happened to be the one in the curriculum, we didn't change the curriculum, we just modified it, was bringing them into literature from the medieval period really took them out of their own space. And I felt that it was a welcome distraction from what was going on in the world and their lives, and offered them a sort of a little bit metacognitive, but also fantastic in the sense of fantasy, away from reality. And the final projects they did were wildly creative. They really put their full effort into it, and I felt that then we were doing something that was worthwhile. So I thought that comment was important for you to hear about using our shared space and using the curriculum as a distraction. I know there's been a lot of talk on social media about teaching vocabulary lists of pandemic words, and I made the decision not to do any of that and just focus on what was in the curriculum and that shared space together. Okay, Mike and Deb, I'm going to stop there. The only other things left in the PowerPoint are, oh, I'm sorry, I did forget to mention this. I'll stop in 1 second, Mike and Deb. This is just a quick little list of 5 things that the university students said when I asked for feedback about the synchronous lesson. So I'll let you have a second to look through that. I think that those 5 points really encapsulate their experience. So the only other thing in the PowerPoint are resources. I've spent some time putting together some resources for you, and there's multiple pages of them there in the PowerPoint. I think now I'll go back. I won't go back to the chocolate cake, although that would be great. We'll go back to looking at Siegfried as he meets his end. And we'll have time now, Mike and Deb, for folks to ask some more of their questions. Sorry about all of the talking. Thank you very much for listening. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Chris. So there were several questions, and you alluded to this about translation programs. So when students are completing these assignments at home in preparation for class, what suggestions do you have to decrease the likelihood students will resort to using Google Translate?
And I'm going to assume that that question means in presentational writing. I'm gonna think that that's what they mean, other than taking the text of, for the example of the university here, the literature text, and putting it into a translator so they can read it only in English. I haven't really thought about that. It would come up in the discussion the next day. It would be very apparent who hadn't read, and I think peer pressure would play a role. The biggest issue I deal with that in the high school setting is when students have to do some presentational writing. When I ask them to write a journal, I ask them to write weekly, just a regular old journal diary about their lives. And when students do translate it, in the school setting, the public school setting, I present them with the student handbook chapter on cheating and ask them to redo it. And I kind of have a secret, you get 2 of those policies. I think for a student so I had 2 students who did it during this remote instruction. And one of them, I contacted both of them and alerted them to my concern. And one of them was very upset and said, I feel behind, I don't know what I'm doing, and I needed help. And I did that. And I thought, oh, that's resourceful. You're using resources, but I don't want you to do that. I don't think it's your voice. This is my position on Google Translate. I don't think it's your voice. I think looking up a word in a dictionary is a very different experience than writing a text in your first language and having it artificially intelligent translated. I see those as very different experiences. And so I have in the school setting the support of the school rules that don't allow that, but I also had a conversation with students about authenticity and looking ahead to honor codes. Many colleges and universities have honor codes, and there's an expectation for behavior. And I am and would be as transparent as possible to say, this is what we expect, and then carry it forward. I hope that's an okay answer. You want to ask another question?
I do, Chris. I'm going to ask this question about the first. And so
and we had clear understanding of our expectations. That's not possible to do. I don't know how I'm going to do that, let me say it that way, in a remote-only setting for the start of the semester. So I think that's important to put that out there. We talked at length about what it means to be an individual, personalized learner. Students and I talk about how I don't ever want to hear somebody say, I'm turning in my work. I want my points back for my missed assignment. We need to get away from that paradigm. We want the classroom to be a hybrid space. The classroom is a lab. It's a learning environment, and you bring yourself to it. So it's personalized for you. There may be a right answer in whatever structure it is we're working on, but beyond that, it's about your experience and who you are in the classroom, out of the classroom, et cetera. And so what you do out of the classroom is important because it has to have integrity and it has to be personalized. And so if you're encountering something for the first time, you've never seen it before, and there's no teacher to guide you, find your way, develop a system, make a path, come to class the next day and let's talk about it. Very often we'll say, how did you do this? What was your path? And I think earlier, it's important to do that very often to establish it as a norm. And then later, if you throw, I learned at the beginning of remote instruction, we were giving them way too much to do. We had to scale back on that. So with feedback, we can make adjustments. It could possibly be that we introduce something that's way above our level and we don't realize it until we get into it. And then as the instructor, I just have to pull back, take a different course, different route, and try to go to the same thing. But I think developing flexibility from the very beginning, understanding that learning is individualized and personalized is the right path for that.
Okay, thank you, Chris. It's about 2 minutes to 5, and I want to give John a moment to go through his closing remarks. So we want to thank you for your presentation. We know you have our attendees shared many questions, and I'm sure they can reach out to you if they have other questions they want to address with you. I just want to thank you for everything that you shared today, and I'll send it back to John for his closing remarks.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mike, and thank you, Chris, for that very informative presentation. Thank you, Debbie and Mike, for moderating. Chris, I see you put your contact information up on the screen for everybody, so if your question wasn't answered, Chris, are you able to answer questions to people if they email you later?
Be very happy to do that.
Great. As I mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, it has been recorded, and the recording will be made available as soon as possible at nectful.org/webinars. It will probably be later tonight, if not tomorrow. New York State teachers who need proof of attendance for CTLE credit, please use the links provided on our website at nectful.org/webinars. There you will find a confirmation of participation form that you can download and fill out. Then upload that form with the second link provided. This will generate an automatic email to you with your confirmation of attendance. You may use the same form if you are watching this webinar later in its recorded version. If you are from outside New York State, you may use this form as well, but please follow whatever local and state guidelines apply in your state. On behalf of the NECFL Board of Directors, thank you for attending this webinar. Enjoy the rest of your day, and perhaps we'll see you next week at our next webinar in this series. Thank you again, Chris. Bye-bye, and bye, Mike and Debbie.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Thank you.